Hey folks, Dave Nadig here, doing a bit of an impromptu meetup with some friends that you may recognize from the PolyCrisis work we did at Exchange. I'm really excited to be joined by Tom Morgan of Sapient Capital, Adam Butler of Resolve Asset Management, and we have a bit of a spoiler today. We have Kris Abdelmessih, who you may know from MoontowerMeta, I think is the URL. Is that right, Kris?
Yes, it is.
And Kris has been one of my favorite reads since Substack became a thing, and before that, when blogs were a thing, and has been effectively a lifetime options trader who has been a bit of a consumer of a lot of the falderall we've been kicking around for the last 6 months about the state of the world as we know it. We wanted to have a little bit of an update to some of what we talked about on stage in Florida around the PolyCrisis, what's happened in the last quarter. And to my mind, the number one thing that's really happened since we all got together was this sort of explosion of AI. And that, I think, has really brought up a lot of the same issues that we were talking about live on stage down there. So I think that was sort of the point here. But I do want to turn things over to Kris here first, because you're sort of a newcomer to this discussion, and we all sort of get up on our own you-know-whats about a lot of these topics. And you're approaching this from an extraordinarily practical perspective. You've consumed some of the stuff that we put on stage. I know you were a participant in some of the early meetings we had leading up to that. I know you were just saying you were reading some of the work about relevance realization and John Vervaeke. I'd love to get your framing on this, about why you think it's interesting and where you think we need to redirect a little bit.
Yeah. I'll back up for a moment just to kind of go back. I'll tell a little story about something that happened this week, and then that will take me to the entry point as to like why any of this even mattered to me in the first place, which was, I saw a tweet. Somebody had tweeted something. It's somebody that sells courses on selling stuff on the internet. Seems like he's got a lot of very happy clients. They've successfully changed their lives and they're having good businesses and all that. So, this is not a negative thing about this person, but that person did tweet something to the, I'll paraphrase, but it was basically like, you have the right and possibly the imperative to use every tool available that's legal to make money. And, I immediately, I cringed at the sentiment, and the reason, because I've always kind of think of it as like, I think of ethics as a firewall between sort of like the legal line and social norms. And there's like some, like, ethics are, I'm not a philosopher, but my perception is that it's sort of a culturally based idea. Like, it's culturally driven, like where your ethics kind of come from. And if you collapse the firewall and get rid of the ethics layer, you're left in this extremely negative competition, Molochian sort of paradigm where, okay, if you're going to have people that are just reading every single bit of fine print to be like, how can I get an edge by exploiting everybody else's social norms? Well, I'm just left with a tragedy of the commons here, and I'm just, whatever that picture is, sucking oil out of the straw from beneath everybody else's land, right, or whatever, or water. And that was my whole entry point, actually. Like, and the idea of Moloch and the idea of unhealthy competition has been, and Prisoner's Dilemmas, that has been my entry point into all of this, because I'm looking around and thinking, wow, like, this is it. We've went from what feels to me like a 90s culture that was sort of against selling out and against, a poser was the highest insult of
Right.
somebody in the 90s, right? Like a non-craftsman, somebody appropriating some subculture to make a buck. And now we've went to like this opposite, like hustle culture extreme. It feels like we're in 2023. It's just, hey, what it's kind of like what's might is right. What makes a dollar is right. I don't care what the ethics are, and make a dollar however way you seem fit. And that just, the whole thing feels like a race to the bottom to me. And I don't really know how to reconcile, our needs to sort of personal growth, our needs to make profits, and all of that. Like these are real, and our need to survive with sort of pro-social ways of being. And that was my entry. And then it's like this whole relevance realization seems to be some kind of bridge between the two ideas. And that, but it's all over my head, and that's where you guys come in.
I want to hug you, buddy. I so feel you, bud.
Yeah, but Tom, like, I wanted to throw this to you because, like, this is the point of your company, right? I mean, you go to the front page of Sapient Capital, and it says, like, wisdom is on the front page, right?
So, like, Kris, you used a word that I think is super important right now, which is tools. I find the whole AGI discussion, like, above my head, and it's not really very useful right now. But I'm like, okay, we've just made a tool. A hammer can crack a skull or build a cathedral if you put it in, you know, like a serial killer's hands or Leonardo da Vinci's hands. We don't know what this tool does. We don't know how powerful it is, and we don't know whose hands it is in. And even before any of the ChatGPT stuff last year, a bunch of scientists just reversed the sign on their drug discovery tool and created 40,000 chemical weapons in 6 hours. And like, they put out this incredibly self-aware academic paper being like, we crossed a gray moral boundary. We thought we were screwing around in a virtual domain, and we unleashed Moloch. And I think that the tool framework for this discussion is actually super helpful, because who is holding the tool and what are they using it for? And I think the whole idea of wisdom and relevance realization is, you've got this tool. You can use it in a fundamentally zero-sum way, right? Whether it's engagement algorithms or AI, right? Or you can use the tool in a positive sum way. And wisdom is about knowing how to inflect the tool in a positive sum way.
Okay, but can I just extend that metaphor to an unhealthy extent, right? So I think what Kris is kind of saying is, or maybe, and I don't want to put words in Kris's mouth. Here's how I interpret it. You've got an individual with a hammer who wants to use it to build a cathedral, and you're facing an army of people with hammers who want to use it to cave your head in. So talk to me about how relevance realization and wisdom help the individual to bring about the change I think we all want, which is to reorient the army so that, you know, some minority turns majority of those people decide they want to build cathedrals instead. Or am I just completely, you know, misoriented or misunderstanding your basic metaphor?
No, I think you've nailed it. No pun intended. It's basically down to the fact that there's this, and I hesitate to use anything mathematical because Kris is on the line and has forgotten more about maths, and I'll never know. But like, it's my understanding that in game theory, in an iterated game, cooperation beats competition. And one of the guys that's been very influential to me, this guy Brett Anderson, has explained how, you know, the arrow of human evolution and complexity moves through these cycles of cooperation and competition at increasingly greater scale. And these competition stages cash out often through like total chaos at a level of higher cooperation. So to make that less abstract, you have a world war that ends up with the discovery of nuclear weapons that necessitates an environment of international cooperation, unlike anything we've seen at any point prior to that, right? And so you have to have this kind of faith when you're looking at this. You're like, okay, everyone, it may seem like everyone is wants to cave my head in right now. But if you look back through the long arc of human history, the only reason we have space shuttles and antibiotics and everything that you're sitting and enjoying right now is because of incomprehensible human cooperation at core.
Yeah, that to me just sounds like a reiteration of sort of Neil Howe's fourth turning precept, right? That you require these incredible periods of upheaval in order to shake out the excesses of the system. And inevitably what you end up with is a rebuilding, and the act of rebuilding requires more collective effort, right? And I think the challenge, which I think is a legitimate one, is how do we translate from the individual to the whole, right? Because again, if we're going to lean into the hammer metaphor, if the four of us want to build cathedrals, it doesn't really matter if it's 1 or 4 or 400 of us, if we're still just this absolute minority. And, you know, I think, you know, a phrase that we've used amongst ourselves many times is diagnosis is table stakes, right? So yes, AI is a hammer. It is a tool that will be used. Yes, the problem is that it's bad actors all the way down. none of that seems to change this core problem of how do you steer the ship of the collective culture, of collective institutions. And I guess the angle I wanted to take here was, again, a little bit of diagnosis, which is I feel like the way we're reacting to AI is the way we're reacting to a lot of signals we're getting back from the food source, to use the ant metaphor again, right? That our reaction to this new thing in the environment is to immediately try to figure out how to use it to get around the institutions we already have, how to get around academia, how to make a buck in a way that's outside the market, how to do something that breaks out of the system. That feels like a very natural reaction, given what we've seen happen with crypto, given what we've seen happen with ESG, right? All of these signals that we're getting that, hey, there are things that are wrong. It doesn't surprise me that the two reactions we have to AI are similar to the ones we had for crypto. It's going to save the world and everything's going to be fantastic and we no longer have to worry about governments and currencies, or we must shut this thing down. It's the worst thing ever. That seems to be winning at the moment in crypto. I think we have the same issue that's just surfacing again in AI, don't you?
I think like, let's go back to the myths and the pop culture references I love so much, right? Luke Skywalker, rejects the call and stays on Tatooine until his aunt and uncle are murdered, right? Frodo doesn't leave the Shire until the ring wraiths find him. Neo doesn't leave the Matrix until he gets interrogated by the agents, right? These aren't just pop culture references. The archetypal hero's journey has a refusal of the call until there's a crisis, right? And the same thing happens in our own lives when we're in a bad personal spot, but things are really objectively comfortable for us, so we don't leave until like our health starts to deteriorate, right? Where we are right now, I feel possibly low confidence assertion is that the PolyCrisis is bad, but it's not bad enough to force any systemic change. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this discussion, right? Like it would just be changing. But what we might be going into, for positive or negative, is kind of this sorcerer's apprentice situation where we get given this incredibly powerful magic. Things get incredibly chaotic, and then we are forced to grow up. We are forced to make decisions that are much harder and much more urgent than they have been before. And during that process, I would rather that there are wiser people in charge than there currently are, because the institutions are going to be forced to change through the discovery of more powerful magic.
That's great. I mean, I actually feel like we're closer with those statements than we've been through most of the arc of our discussions, right? So what I'm hearing you say is that there needs to be change at the top in order to shepherd us through what is likely to be a very challenging time for humanity. It needs to be a challenging time because challenge is typically what galvanizes enough human will to be able to move or transcend to that next level of being, right? So that's great. My big dissonance is, are there steps that we can take to make that process more like the Great Depression than like the Dark Ages, or like in Foundation psychohistory? Like, are there steps that we can take to make that Dark Age 100 years instead of 10,000 years? I feel like me being wise enough and meditating in my home or writing what are effectively sort of almost like mini prayers that go out into the universe is not sufficient, right? It's nice, it's helpful to sort of orient oneself, but it's not sufficient to motivate the magnitude and breadth of change that are required in order to short circuit what seems to be an excruciatingly tortuous path ahead that could last a really long time if we don't affect some of those big changes relatively quickly.
I think the biggest cause of nihilism, particularly into the younger generation, is the idea that you can't fit your arms around the problem. Like the word polycrisis, right? It's everywhere, right? And you can't fit your arms around it. And if you try and fit your arms around it, it'll tear your arms off. And I see a lot of people being like, what can I do about climate change? And it's an absurd statement, right? Like, so what do you do? And I think actually I take a lot of solace from physics and Taoism, because they say the same thing effectively, which is that if you become completely congruent with your environment, by pursuing your niche, basically just doing what you should be doing, you could eventually have an outsized positive impact on the world around you in a way that is not immediately determined, right? Like you do you to such an unbelievable extent that you get to a point of congruence where you can click your fingers and make a thunderstorm appear, right? To bring the old sage cliche. But all that means is that there's a niche for you. The system complexifies by people occupying their niche with sufficient slack and shelter from Moloch to do that, which means that you can hopefully create a solution to this, at least on a micro level, by pursuing that which is interesting to you and that which serves a positive sum game.
That just
no.
That sounds very unsatisfying to me. That sounds like tech bros justifying doing whatever the heck they want to do.
No, because they're not. Those aren't positive sum games. You have to. The most important thing is whether the door's open, whether the synchronicities are there, whether the universe responds in the right way. I appreciate this all sounds like woo nonsense, right? But like, if you pursue a zero sum game and just do whatever you want to do, and the world doesn't respond, you are not playing the right game. And I know there's a certain leap of faith like implied in that statement, but you've seen throughout human history, whether it's like Mandela or Solzhenitsyn, these people that existed in these fundamentally broken systems, and all they did is come out and tell the truth, and they fundamentally changed the nature of the whole system. And I think that concept is applicable to all of us, and that therefore frees us from, Adam, I know you're much more of a top-down person than I am, because I feel like all emergent moves have to be bottoms up, that I feel that the society can actually move that way, and often moves that way incredibly quickly. There's a lot of, Erica Chenoweth at Harvard has shown that you need 3% of the population to be involved in socialism movement before it can tip, right? You can get a lot of moves in that direction, and I think COVID may have started that.
I just think it's state dependent, right? Like there are periods in history where there's a lot of tinder. And so if you set a few sparks, in all likelihood, you're going to set a fire that will turn into some kind of raging phenomenon, right? Call it the 1950s, 1960s were sort of like that, right? We had DARPA, we had NASA, we had NASA, and then we sort of had DARPA and all the amazing fundamental science and tech that grew out of that then powered an enormous innovation wave through the 80s and 90s, right? All of which was top down. Now, I mean, it was individuals within the context of those organizations that made the differences, right? But the organizations and society itself provided a context. Now, contrast that to today, where you've got big tech, big finance, big pharma. They've created these extremely stable equilibria within their own domains through regulatory capture and scale, so that you've got sparks are happening all over the place, but they're happening in the dark when there's no tinder, right? And where a spark does flourish, it then is gobbled up by the apparatus, whether it's the corporate apparatus,
this gets
general, or it's the state apparatus, it beholden to the corporate apparatus that is stifling it with regulation, right? So it's just this, we're in this ultra deep well of equilibrium that's stifling all effort to cultivate emergent phenomena that might shift us out of this equilibrium.
I think this goes right back to Kris's point. So I'd like you to talk about this, Kris. I mean, you started this with talking about the challenge of, is there an ethical code that lives alongside generating wealth, right? Is the moral highest ground to get the maximum amount of money, i.e. the maximum amount of power as possible before you die? Because that's sort of what you were holding up as the tweet storm that started your thinking about this. Like, what do you think? Like, do you believe that there's an opportunity here for that kind of big structural change, or are we just,
So this kind of bring in the idea of like some path dependence, because I think what happens, what I'm seeing. I mean, if we look around, and Adam, you kind of already hinted at it, but you have this apparatus, which is, we can summarize it with software's eating the world. I think that's sort of like, if we just say that a smaller number of corporate interests are basically like every rent will have been sought at some like it's all going to be captured. And we have an apparatus right now where like a handful of firms, and yes, they might jostle around, but for the most part, a small number of people will swallow everything. But there is a sort of, I don't know, it's like a self-correcting irony to it, which is that if you end up, for example, 10 years ago, we said, oh, the truck drivers are all screwed and the coders are going to, learn to code, whatever. And we can't really be sure of that, because what will happen is, like, if technology commoditizes all the abstraction, like when I think about my life, I'm like, oh, I'm so lucky to be born when I was born, because I'm more geared towards like abstract kind of stuff. Like if you put me out in the fields, I'm cooked. Like that's not going to work. I'm not going to go out there and battle, right? So the end result of that is that if like all the abstraction gets actually commoditized, and then like your barber turns out to be like the differentiated person in this new kind of world, like is that somewhat self-correcting? And if it's not self-correcting, I mean, it's hard to imagine that kind of domination not leading to revolution. It's like eventually that's kind of where I would think that something like this heads. And that's, I don't know how that kind of plays out. Like that is very much. It's funny. I was just in Vietnam a couple of weeks ago, and I was going, down the rabbit hole of reading about those times. And what was so interesting to me was that I didn't know this until I was there, but one of the the communist lines of propaganda was the quote, "Nothing is more precious than independence and freedom." And I think to an American, reading that from a communist sounds deeply ironic. But really what they were referring to was Vietnam was in the throes of like under imperial rule. I mean, they were talking about kicking out the French. So in context, that made a lot of sense to them. And of course, the irony of that, the ultimate irony there, is that the people who freed them became the oppressors. And it's and that's kind of like, if and it's kind of how I see it, is like people are rebelling, or they're not quite there yet, right? Like it's like I watched the 4-hour documentary on HBO Max of George Carlin over the weekend, and Carlin at the end of his career, he basically said, I am a bystander to this human project. I no longer see myself as part of this. And once I created that distance, I was able to live with him. He was so nihilistic. He was like, I can't even, the only way I can survive this is to look at this as a bystander and totally reject it. And that's, if we collectively arrive at that point, that's, there's nothing left to do but revolt. I mean, it's really...
Let me spin a Pollyanna version of that, because I don't disagree with you, right? I think I agree with that observation, but here's a version of it that I think is a positive outcome that doesn't involve blood in the streets at the same extent that sounds like, right? It doesn't involve completely dismantling every institution. One of the things, one of the lines about AI that came out was like, well, everybody who writes for a living is going to be out of a job. And my immediate reaction, which I wrote about a month ago, was like, actually, I believe the exact opposite. I believe all of a sudden we're going to start caring a very large amount about who is writing the things that we read in a way that we don't right now. Like right now, if you're reading just the Wall Street Journal, there may be a byline or two that a Jason Zweig or something like that, but you don't really know who the front page writer is anymore, right? We no longer revere fundamental journalists the way we did, say, in the 50s and 60s, where everything was bylined and everybody understood, and editorial boards really mattered. And when they gave endorsements to politicians, it really mattered and moved the needle. I think we may actually head back to a world that way, because if you no longer believe that the music you're listening to is created by a real musician, or the art that you're looking at was painted by a human artist, or the book that you're reading was written by a human author, I think we'll start caring much more about that, precisely because we'll long for that human experience. I think that you cannot commodify the majority of the human experience to just information. I think the human connectivity really matters. So I think that's part of what the sort of meaning crisis stuff that Vervaeke has leaned so hard into. I think part of the reason that resonates with a lot of particularly intellectual people is because it provides a pathway towards community that doesn't seem to exist if you just project all this tech forward, right? So I think there's hope in that. At least I hope there is.
In my analogy, by the way, that's that writer that you just said, that's the barber. So like the barber does,
yeah, absolutely.
The thing, like the barber does, like his relevance comes back because just because of the yin yang of it. It's almost like a positional scarcity thing. It's like, if you commodify this has to go up.
There's a super cool idea here, and I'm going to really screw this up because it's so hard to explain, and it took me like a couple of years. But it's like, so Scott Alexander, who did the original piece on Moloch, did a follow-up a few years later, I think in 2020, on called Studies on Slack, which I know we talked about, Kris, but I think we've all talked about, right? And it's this, when you get stuck in a fitness basin, to use your analogy, Adam, the only way you get out is by being given space for exploration, right? And our society at the moment is so punitive, particularly at the low end, but also in terms of like the duration for which companies now survive on the stock market. We're in a very, very, very overly competitive zero-sum Molochian environment. So you're like, all right, what is the structural antidote? It is Slack. It is giving people space, right? And there's almost a paradox here. I was recommended a book a couple of weeks ago called The World Beyond Your Head. Strongly recommend to anyone listening, by Matthew Crawford. And to paraphrase his whole argument, it's basically like there is enormous freedom in the pursuit of highly focused, embodied concentration on a skill or a trade, because it tethers you to the world in a way that is fundamentally relational, that we kind of think about being all up in our heads with really clever, thinky ideas is kind of the apex of human development. And he's like, no, you have this relation to the world when you're a glass blower or an organ maker or a mechanic that is really, really rich and is not like other people experience. And if we are given the opportunity to explore the whole landscape of the earth, because we have the freedom to do that, and maybe without the social disdain for people that work in physical jobs, that helps us seek our niche in a more productive way, and it helps us get more connected to the real world. Does that make sense to you guys?
It does, except for it's so far away from where we are. It's like, if we lived in the Star Trek universe, then we'd all have an enormous amount of Slack.
Totally disagree. Totally disagree. Like, I think, so one of the things that CogSci and tech overlap on and have for a decade has been AI, right? Because if you're trying to create an artificial general intelligence, understanding how this one works is a helpful guidepost. And just this weekend, Vervaeke did a lecture in which he posited that one of the challenges we may have with AI is that I think we would all want AI to have what we would consider positive traits of humanity, right? That there are things about like being autopoiesis, right? The idea that you're generally life supporting, right? You're trying to bring more life into being. You are trying to support the life that is around you. That is not something that is natural. That is something that is learned as humans. It's not necessarily a function of intelligence, right? The love of life, the love of wisdom, those aren't necessarily required to be smart or intelligent or even rational, but they are required to be human in any meaningful way that we would describe. And his argument, coming from a neuro and cog-sci perspective, is that our embodied cognition, like literally the fact that our nervous system doesn't stop at the top of our necks and just live in our heads, but that we actually are continuously interacting with all of these biological systems, which are predicated on being born and born into an attachment relationship for survival, right? That's evolutionarily, attachment relationships and a love of life are part of how we survive. it's really challenging to think about how you bake that into an artificial system, to a non-biological system. And there are folks exploring that, like IBM is actually trying to develop wetware, literally, to try to crack some of those nuts. And there's also pieces of it around analog processing, right? We are not digital in our construction. We are analog in our construction. The machines we're developing, we're having to build in analog functionality on top of digital functionality to try to replicate that. So I'm quite encouraged that that embodiment turns out to be a big part of the AI problem. And I love the idea that that might be self-referential, that we start looking at ourselves differently because we need to establish what is different about us from the machine.
Yeah, I was going to say to this, and it kind of riffs off that, but it really goes back to what Tom was saying about the book, Crawford's book. When I listened to your synopsis of the book, I heard something that was very, let's just say, like a little bit utilitarian, in the sense that there was the sense there when I heard it that said, it's what this person, let's say the barber, is this person's use is from where his value comes. But then we know that's incomplete. If you have a special needs child that will never have commercial value to the system, but it's like value is unquestioned. Where like I'm very hesitant to like appreciate sort of an argument that moors us somehow to our utility and refuses to acknowledge that the act of being born was like an act that there was value there in the first, like this is like so fundamental to us being humans. And in a sense, like it's almost like the whole Overton window of the conversation is happening in ignorance of that. I'm not phrasing it well, but
no, I completely understand with what you're saying. I completely get it. Which is why I'm going to go to a really, really weird place, and Dave can probably anticipate where, right? So, one of the interesting ideas I've encountered through doing this sort of going in this evolutionary psychology and complex adaptive systems deep dive over the last few years is this idea of like energetic gradients. And Dave will pick me up when I get this wrong, but like, so if you think about a bacterium, if you drop it in a sugar solution, it will learn to follow the sugar solution because the bacterium that goes the opposite direction gets selected against really, really quickly, right? And one of the benefits of consciousness is if Adam wants to go and get a burrito from Chipotle, and I walk up to him and I say, Adam, Chipotle's closed today. He's like, well, I'm going to go to the salad place instead. So he's mentally mapping a way to get himself to the sugar solution. And the sugar solution is just a stand-in for energy. And one of my weirdest views is that embodied cognition, and I suspect our heart center, situates us in an environment in a way that it determines relevance, such that we can pursue information that is relatively specific to us. I do not know how specific. That evolves us into a niche. And by us occupying a niche, the whole system becomes more complex and more resilient. So the whole monetary value thing, it kind of freaks me out in that I don't know to what extent any of the things I've just said are consistent with capitalism, right? Folly or bliss and doors will open will only there are walls. Do they open? They've opened for me as a result of following my bliss. Like, how smart is the environment? How much can you respond to those environmental cues? I don't know. I don't know if it's a viable strategy, but I do know that it fits all the other parts of it. And I do think that relevance realization is fundamentally an embodied act, because actually, like, even from a neurological perspective, our exploratory attention is determined by a right hemisphere, which predominantly connects to our body and our heart.
Yeah, I kind of feel like there's three slightly different conversations going on, right? Tom's talking about embodied biological substrates. Dave's talking about embodied silica substrates. Kris is talking about, are we only going to define value in the future based on economic utils? And there was a discussion of Slack, which I kind of want to go back to, because like Slack, embodiment, embodied wisdom, flow, like all this stuff to me really resonates with me. I'm in a privileged position of having lots of time to spend in Slack high flow states. But I think the overarching point here is that 99.99% of humanity has no slack and no prospect of the kind of slack that you're describing that would allow them to manifest, whether it's biological embodied wisdom or AI facilitated embodied wisdom, and are purely at the mercy of a system that only views them from the perspective of their economic utility. And until we break out of this frame, then all of this stuff is really nice for us to sit around and talk about, but it's not going to have any impact on.
But isn't that exactly what we're talking about? We're talking about, these reactions to institutional decay. Like, I think the reason those reactions are happening, like the anti-capitalism movements that you've seen in Gen Z pretty strongly, the anti-work movements, the labor movements, right? These are natural reactions to a system which is clearly not meeting basic human needs anymore, right? And Kris, I love that you framed this right out of the gate with that tweet about, like, do you have a moral obligation to make as much money as possible using every tool at your disposal? I cringe at that idea too. I think increasingly more and more people cringe at that idea as well. There's always going to be hustle culture. Some loud percentage of the population is going to be absolutely obsessed with power accumulation at any costs, for whatever reasons, whether they want to do something noble with that power and money or not. But I actually look around and I see a lot of the social upheaval over the last couple of years of the pandemic actually in a fairly positive light, because it seems like a reaction function against that very system that is trapping people in a world where they don't have slack. They don't have the ability to focus on embodied wisdom or any of these BS things.
I have to say, I find the whole discussion about the lottery of birth, and you can talk about this because you have privilege, an incredibly nihilistic direction to go in, because it's like, well, I am here, right? And if I am in a position where I'm fortunate enough to have these discussions, I need to maximize my ability to do good in precisely that environment by reaching the people that are interested in what we have to say, if there's something positive to say.
We agree, of course. Completely agree with that. I think we have an obligation to have these conversations. I just think that we have an obligation to ground the conversations in the current reality and not sort of skip forward in time and place and context to a time when these ideas are going to apply more directly and practically to a large enough proportion of people's lives for it to actually matter, right? Like, I think we actually have time we have the slack to ruminate, to talk, to read, to research, to make mistakes, to be in flow states. We need to use these to have these kinds of conversations, but like, let's try to stay in the realm of the practical rather than the realm of the if.
I totally agree. And I would say, like, one, I would also question whether, like, the rates of mental illness and midlife crisis and depression are way outsized, at least diagnosed, in the West, right? So, like, to argue that we're the fortunate ones may not quite be the right framing, that actually we may be existing in a deeply toxic, broken system. And because it's visibly comfortable, that might be masking a lot of problems that are like the mine filling, the gas filling the mine, and which is a view that I often suspect is true. All right, brass tacks. I'll pretend I'm talking to my incredibly practical, slightly cynical wife, right? Like, what do we do with any of this information? Because I've been trying to land this plane for years now. And I think it's straightforward, but not easy, which is that you have to understand that there's an energetic signature to information, that there is information that interests you more than other information. And if you have the courage, slack, or faith, using that charged word, to pursue that information, it will involve a positive direction for your life and for your personal evolution, but in an inherently unpredictable way. I have now seen this play out in enough people purely within my own life to believe it is true, but it also corresponds now with a lot of like contemporary science in ways that is not nearly as woo-woo as it sounds. And I think if there was a message that I could come out with, it is this concept of following your bliss, not doing whatever you want, but doing stuff that the world is reacting to you in a very positive way. You enjoy it and the world needs. Finding that match is the job of a lifetime, and it's incredibly difficult. But having the relevance realization to realize where your impact is greatest is sort of this definition of wisdom, and it's an ongoing process. So I feel this is practical, and it's about the demonstration of faith in the way that you approach the information in your life. Is that still too abstract?
No, I like that. I think that's good. I mean, I think that applies to everybody, regardless of situation, right? I mean, most people may have a really flat gradient to play with, right? Like that may just be the reality. But it's probably not totally flat, right? And at least you can keep your eyes open for increases in gradient, right? These are opportunities. I'm gonna orient toward that to the extent I can, right? So I could qualify that with a bunch of different things, but I'll leave it there and let others react.
Kris, I want your vibe on that.
Oh yeah, I struggle to bridge that to going back to what Adam was saying about you're picking rice in a field somewhere, and what are your options for relevance realization? Like what's the menu? What's your menu? And maybe the menu there, and maybe the menu there is intertemporal. Like it's like, hey, my role is to do this so that my kid will have a better menu. Maybe that's my role. And as an outsider to that, I'm like, that doesn't look like a great menu, but I get it. And when we know people, like, I mean, I grew up in a house like that. Like if this person can come to sort of, and this is like maybe the role of faith or the role of sort of like understanding a bigger picture so that you can situate yourself in there and be like, I still have meaning because my situation might not be that great. And maybe, and going back to what Tom said about the, like, is the American actually privileged given what we've seen about our rates of depression, mental health, drug abuse, all of these things. When I hear that, I think there are definitely structural issues in this country. I mean, we've medicated the whole country and, Sackler and all that kind of stuff. But like there's also this like gap between what's the happiness is the gap between reality and expectations. I mean, I come back to that all the time. I mean, it's just like appears everywhere I look. It seems like such a cornerstone of our psychology is appreciating this. And maybe that's just the American plight is that, I think I read it while I was in Vietnam. I read The Sympathizer, and he's writing as a Vietnamese. He's a Vietnamese immigrant, and he's writing, and he's an observer of American culture, kind of like the Tocqueville was, right? He's looking at it, he's like, oh, America doesn't promise. There's no promise of prosperity. It's a promise of a chance at prosperity. But he goes, it's basically a lotto, and everybody's paying for the one person to win it. And he's like, that doesn't sound like such a great deal. And I've often thought, like, in this country, like kind of issues they're talking about, is like, this country's great if you are born with the skills that are adapted to what this country rewards.
Right.
But like for most people, they might just be better off not in this system. Yeah. So that's kind of, and this is like just being really practical. Like, I don't know everybody in every culture, how they bridge what meaning is to them. And then the meaning feels so cultural to me. Like in this country, meaning is so economic.
Right.
And I don't see that in, when I look at like my in-laws family, like I just don't see it the same way exactly. And maybe I'm just too online to think that maybe I'm compressing American culture too much too.
Well, we all live in our own little reality tunnel, right? So like we all have our own perception of what American culture is. I'm sure, mine, like all of y'all's, is heavily influenced by my kids, right? They're a huge cultural window into what I see because they expose me to media I wouldn't otherwise consume, trends I wouldn't otherwise see, people I wouldn't otherwise see, and it's one thing to say, yeah, well, we'll travel around, go to a lot of different cities, go to different countries, go to different parts of the country. And then you'll really understand what it means, but that's just a little tunnel as well. Right. So, we all carry with us that baggage no matter where we go. I do think, we brought up this idea of faith, and Kris, you used the idea of meaning several times. Like, if what we are hungry for as a species is having a fulfilling and meaningful life, which I think is a reasonable guess, not to beat up on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the reality in this country is that it's relatively straightforward to meet your basic caloric needs, right? To stay housed enough to not die and to eat enough to not die. Now, it's harder here than it is in a lot of other developed democracies, but we are not in a world where 50% of the population is not getting the first two levels of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So the question then becomes, why are we spending so much time reinvesting in that bottom layer? Because that's really what most economic activity in this country seems to be, right? Having more stuff, having better food. None of that necessarily leads to anything like meaning. All of that requires actual act by the human being to do a thing, right? And that's been my revelation, has been that meaning comes from choosing to do things, right? What you pay attention to, who you choose to hang out with, what you choose to spend your time on. That seems to be the big deal. And so, when we're talking about making things practical and how people take things away, I reject the opening of this, whatever we're calling this podcast, completely. Like, the idea that your moral obligation is to accumulate as much money as possible. I find that abhorrent in every possible way, because what you should be doing is trying to, I believe the human condition would dictate, is to make the world better for more humans, right? That seems to be the basic driving force of humanity, right? Not just the survival of me as an individual.
This is super, super crazy, interesting idea that I took from Ken Wilber's sort of attempt at a theory of everything, which is that, like, so what happens is you get to these stages where competition gets like way out of control, which if it gets too bad, that sort of describes cancer, right? Where individual agents start putting their needs above the needs of the whole, and the whole system becomes unstable and collapses. That's my view of contemporary American capitalism, where there are too few winners and they've taken advantage of the whole, right? You could also argue that it's the dynamic of tech, which puts the needs of the monopolies ahead of the needs of the users, and as a result, the systems become quite fragile. So what happens is you get this big dissonance and instability in the system created by this excess of competition. Then there's this descent into chaos and a restructuring at a higher level of cooperation. But what's really interesting to me is you don't strip out that aspect of competition. You invert it and reintegrate it in a competitive way. So the market is the best thing ever, right? Look at where we're sitting. Look at what we're doing. Look at the comfort that we have. But at the moment, it's just gone out of whack, and it's not serving the system which it was developed to serve. It's not serving all the participants. It's not serving the environment. Same with technology. And it's the same, actually, I believe, within ourselves, that we have this incredibly powerful analytical intelligence that's become overdeveloped and is taking us away from our embodiment, that also just needs to be placed back into the control of a more holistic intelligence. That idea is fractal, and I've been unable to find things you can't apply it to. But it's also like the way that you structure this within your own life, which is, all right, what have I spent my life doing? Okay, there seems to be a pattern to this thing that I've spent my life doing. What if I find ways to try and use that in a positive some way? And that requires a huge amount of experimentation, but that's how you restabilize the system, hopefully without a collapse.
Why would people go out of their way to act in a pro-social way that contributes to the system when they have every reason to believe that the product of their good nature will be captured and used against them by a profit-seeking entity?
Because if you behave that way, you will enter a crisis, as I did. Right, and as so many people I've dealt with on Wall Street have, that if you structure your life based around Molochian principles, everything starts falling apart for you in rational and quite woo-woo ways. And that's why the hero's journey results in this call to adventure, you're going wrong, refusal of the call, I'm very comfortable, crisis, you ignored me for too long. And then you have to cross the threshold and you actually go through the confrontation with the Moloch, right? That happens on an individual level. And again, it sounds woo, but look around, you see it all the time. That people can go their whole lives without coming to these epiphanies, and very often do. I'm not saying it happens to everyone, but you'll notice the people who are clearly drowning out the call with booze, with more material, with everything else. I think we're doing it as a society right now. So you can do you, and particularly the mindset that you talk about, where if I don't do this, someone else is going to screw me. I've just noticed that people's lives go incredibly badly when they do that. And actually people's lives go incredibly well in unpredictable ways when they don't do that. And actually one thing I'd like to see more of in life is people telling those stories about people that inverted their skills and things started going really, really well. But those are hard stories to tell because they seem irrational. Kris, sorry.
Yeah, Tom. So what you said there is, you mentioned about, the people, if they follow Molochian principles, that they will have their crisis eventually. The problem would be is if the system were such that the people that rose to the top, the billionaires, were selected from the sample of people, and I think this is basically true, who will never have that crisis.
They're immune to it. Yeah,
they're immune. They're never going to do that. So if you have it's like,
I call that the psychopath problem. Exactly.
Yeah, we are like, if you create the rules so that the psychopaths can see their wildest dreams realized, most people might have that crisis, but the people you care about not to have that crisis will never have it.
Right, but I'll argue that the people in this call probably know more billionaires than the average person. And I always think of King Midas, right? You want everything to turn to gold, and then your daughter turns to gold. I know a lot of Midases where we can point to these people and be like, wow, look at the jets. Look at what things they have. And this sounds like a bit of a cliche, but like, get to know those people. And the thing about psychopaths, Adam, is that psychopaths are like, the nature of psychopathy is massive abstraction. And the nature of meaning is massive connectivity, how relationally connected you are to the world. Maybe this is idealized, but maybe the guy in the paddy field feels fundamentally connected to the world in a way that we simply can't understand because we're up in our head. We look at that guy and be like, wow, he must be so unhappy. And it's like, no, he experiences the world in a way that we can't even hope to dream of. And if you look at different cognitive styles across the world, that is actually a thing. So I'm like, yeah, we can all point on paper to these guys that seem to be living it. But look at the billionaires that are public. Look at the people that we know. Yeah. Look at their families. Look at their relationships. They're all pretty bloody rubbish, at least most of the ones that I can think of. Not across the board.
And yet they're the ones with the power projection to change the system based on the system's rules, right? That's the challenge, right? Is, the individual level, which we've talked a lot about, and I agree with, and it can sound very woo and Pollyanna, but I think is actually true. So I'm with you, Tom, on that stuff. That's actually the easier stuff. The challenge is, I don't know how anybody gets in Elon Musk's head and has him have the kind of crisis that leads to deeper meaning, in which case he would use his power for, positive sum games writ large. I don't see that evidence. And that seems like a tougher nut to crack. I want to be conscious of the fact that this has been an hour that I've sucked out of everybody's day here to talk about some pretty wild and woolly stuff. We covered some AI stuff. We talked a little bit about CogSci. We talked about the meaning crisis. I think we hit a lot of things. I'm not sure we solved any of them, but I'm not sure these are the kinds of things that ever get solved in a group of four folks having a conversation. But gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. And for everybody who watched this, thanks for listening.
Thank you for having us, guys.
You're going to hold us to an hour every time. We're going to do this pretty regularly.